All righty. Hello, everybody out in Facebook land. This is Jeanette, the program coordinator from Whistler Public Library, coming to you live from her kitchen in Alpine for this virtual event tonight. We're really delighted to have some folks with us on Zoom and some folks watching on Facebook. No matter where you're watching from, you can ask questions during this live event. The sort of format we're going to follow is about an hour from our guest, Dr. Reimer, and then we have some time for questions at the end. Now, I would like to officially open our event by expressing my gratitude that we are able to gather tonight on the shared traditional unceded territories of the Squamish Nation and the Lil'wat Nation. Perhaps you're watching from elsewhere, so please do let us know where you're watching from and what territories you may be on tonight. But I know I, for one, am very grateful to live, work, and play on these territories. I would also like to thank our partners, the Squamish Public Library. Thanks, guys. It's been an unexpected pleasure of these very weird times that we have been able to do some more collaborating with local libraries, Squamish and Pemberton libraries. So it's a strange silver lining, but it's a good one. So thanks to our pals in Squamish for co-hosting this event. And I think that's all I have to say. We're really delighted to be hosting Dr. Rudy Reimer tonight. He is an associate professor in the archaeology department and the Indigenous Studies department at SFU. And well, you know why you're all here. You know what he's talking about tonight. So I am going to mute myself and pass it over to Dr. Reimer. Take it away.
What you got tonight up Siam and Siates Yunks Queensna Squamish Snatchum Rudy Reimer Hulayton Snatchum Kiachton Stopmuth Tamail. Yeah, I'll keep the introductions short and just say welcome to you all from whatever territory that you're coming in on. My Squamish Nation ancestral name is Yunks. That comes from the Billy and Moody families in the Squamish Nation. And my English name is Rudy Reimer. I'll get into more of my personal background as we move along. And thank you, Jeanette, for inviting me here this evening. It's an honor to be here to speak to the communities. And I have to admit, my talk this evening is going to be a little different from the title and the abstract that I sent along. I thought I would change it up a little to give you an idea about the work that I've been doing for the last almost 30 years in the sea to sky corridor, and just give you some of the highlights about the developments in archaeology and how that relates to communities, because we're talking about Squamish, we're talking about Whistler, we're talking about North Van, wherever you might be. And I wanted to change the focus into communities. And what are the things that bring us together as people? And what we refer to in the Squamish language as Stotmuth. We refer to ourselves as Stotmuth. We are human beings. And so what draws us together as humans, as people in these difficult times? So I wanted to focus more on that rather than what I initially sent to Jeanette. So apologies if you were expecting something a little different, but I will still highlight on some of the stuff that I've done in media that and how that relates to what we're going to explore this evening. So thank you, Chenquing Katomi, for your kind attention, for being here this evening. It really means a lot to reach out to you, a broader audience that is not just academics at universities in the ivory towers. So here's an outline of what I want to talk to you as an audience to this evening. I'll just give some personal history to start out with. And apologies, it's not potlatch laws, it's more protocols. These are the things from a cultural perspective that I've been taught, coming from my community, to speak to what guides my research. It's more my sort of theoretical perspective. I want to talk about some past projects that I've done that are about communities, some of the current projects that I'm doing right now as a faculty member at SFU, and some planned projects. I'm very happy to announce that I am nominated as a Canada Research Chair Tier 2 in community public archaeology in the Department of Archaeology. So my research is going to be focused much more in the coming years. And then I want to finish up about why this is so important to take this approach, considering the history of archaeology as a discipline in relation to the United Nations declarations of Indigenous rights and peoples that's been recognized by the Canadian government and the provincial government of BC, but also at SFU with the Aboriginal Reconciliation Report that is titled Nothing About Us Without Us, and how research should be guided by certain ethical principles. And then we can finish up with any discussions and questions at the end. So a little more about me. Here's a slide about 15 years ago. I've been doing archaeology in the Pacific Northwest for almost 30 years now. I started out at Capilano College in Squamish and North Vancouver way back in the mid 1990s. I then switched to finish my BA at SFU in 1998. I went straight into a master's thesis that I'll talk more about later in 2000 at SFU. And I took a bit of a sabbatical from academic studies. But then I went back to do my PhD at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, where I finished that up in 2012. But in 2009, while still finishing my PhD, I applied for a job at SFU in First Nation Studies, which is now Indigenous Studies, and got hired. So it was an excellent opportunity to work in my home territory. And as a cross-appointed faculty member, I've been working there for many years now. And I got tenure in 2017. And so as such, my position and duties have changed over the years, but it's a fantastic place to be. So in terms of Potlatch Protocols, here's sort of a schematic of some of the things that guide my research. And we think about basketry. You might be closer to the interior or the coast, but different communities have things that bind us together as communities. There are the warps and wefts, the things that go up and down and sideways and so on. And how those are woven together are the things that make us feel welcome, how we are honored, how we reflect on our history, how we go about our day-to-day work, and how we nourish ourselves, not just intellectually, physically, emotionally, and so on, that keep us as a cohesive community. And so just to get into this a little bit more, here's a photo of one of my cousins, and you know, we can think about these warps and wefts, and they represent the strands of life that connect us together, and how we share knowledge, how we share community values, how it represents our diversity, and how these things are woven together determines how we operate as a society. And so when we think about how we greet and welcome each other, we talk about as Indigenous peoples, what are our origins? What community do you belong to? And so these images here, the top figure is a new welcoming figure here at SFU that was carved by one of my cousins. And this relates to protocols of welcoming and greeting. And the bottom picture is related to our canoe protocols. And within these things, when you see them, they are what we refer to in academia as heuristic devices. They say, it gives you an idea, it gives you a signal to your mental mind of who and where you come from. And when you state these things as Indigenous people, or even as non-Indigenous people, it's about establishing relationships. It says who you are, where you come from, what's your background, and do we have a relationship? And if we don't, how can we begin to establish a relationship in various ways? And so when people are welcomed in various ways, and if you have a cultural understanding about how this operates, people are more conducive to contributing to something positive. And so for me, this is very important on how I conduct my research. And we can talk about nourishment, and for Indigenous people, feasting is not just about physical food. It's about, yes, it's about food. You know, you may have heard about the potlatch or other ceremonies, but eating and feasting is about bringing people together to share those ideas, those cultural values. And so when you choose to invite people to come into a community to participate in certain things, what's at the table and what's being served is carefully chose. And so when we as Indigenous people choose to nourish each other, we also choose to nourish people from outside of our communities, and vice versa. So this is very important. And so this is all encapsulated within doing cultural work. And so we as Indigenous people carry ancestral names. I mentioned mine at the beginning. And to live up to these responsibilities is connected to your cultural identity. And so when you have these connections, it allows you access to cultural knowledge. So for me as a researcher, I can speak to my elders, I can speak to other people in my community to access and share that knowledge. And so this allows me through various filters to be able to give through my research back to a different community, the academic community. And so this works in two ways. It moves back and forth between Indigenous communities and the academic community. So by doing this work through a cultural filter that I'm presenting here, allows for ways to understand different things in a variety of ways. And so when this happens, when this is established, people participating in this research cannot be truly passive. When you're invited in to partake in the research or partake into cultural events, you are a witness and you are given responsibility. And so through this, you are given insight into the tangible, the physical things about the research, but also the intangible things, the cultural knowledge, the place names, the language and the history that for Indigenous people that are not separate. And so when this is enabled, it allows a creative dynamic for knowledge to be shared between Indigenous people and academic researchers. And so what I like to do now is provide you with a quick summary. I could spend hours and hours on each of these topics, but just to give you a quick summary of what I've been doing in terms of community archaeology in the last almost 30 years is a whole series of projects that you can see here on the slide. And most of this is guided by the cultural knowledge that's been passed to me by community elders, generation by generation. And this image here that you can see of Chief Capilano Joe leaving to London in 1906 is an iconic image of Coast Salish. We refer to them as Siam. And Siam roughly translates nowadays into chiefs. But for us, it's they are respected people, and they are heads of houses. And so the knowledge that I have has been passed down to me as sort of a cultural specialist of a sort from these Siams who are still in our community or have been passed on. So I want to thank them to say Hochka for what they've been provided me over the years of my work. So at Squamish, or Squamish, as some of you probably know it, it's one of the 4 ancestral creation places of the Squamish Nation. And way back in 1993, 1994, a company by the name of Arcus, they're no longer, they've been bought up by other companies, but the Squamish Nation hired them to conduct land claims research. And so many of you may recall in the 1990s the 6-stage treaty process. And so as a result, the Squamish Nation hired Arcus to conduct archaeological research related to what was going on with that land claims process. And so as an undergraduate student, second year at Capilano College, I took a field school out at Fort Langley in 1993 and was actually a crew lead on these excavations. And really what set this apart at this time, way back then in 1993, 1994, was the field crew was dominated by Squamish Nation students, led by me and a couple of other archaeologists from Arcus. And you can see here the excavation unit map of what we did that summer. And what was really interesting about this project was it was an example of household archaeology. So up until this point, many projects on the Northwest Coast looked at these big shellman sites, and that was fascinating in and of its own. But at this time, researchers were going, what's going on inside the houses in which people lived in ancient times? And so you can see here, this is a painting by Paul Kane from the mouth of the Columbia River down in Oregon and Washington. And you can see that dog, and that's a Coast Salish bulldog. And you can see the blanket being woven. And these bulldogs were highly prized. And what we found at Squamish was a high percentage of these bulldogs in the deposits of the site. And so those bones and other materials are currently and have been examined by undergraduate and graduate students here at SFU archaeology. And it's giving us incredible detailed information about the nature of the village site at Squamish going back 2,000 or 3,000 years. Also, when I was doing my undergraduate degree at SFU, I was involved in what is known as cultural resource management. And this is the business side of archaeology in British Columbia. And this is where the majority of archaeological work is done, probably 90, 95 or +%, where various consulting companies, you may have heard of many of them, but they are involved with various communities all across the province and elsewhere, where anything from forestry, highway development, residential development are focused on trying to record, preserve, uh, and interpret the ancient archaeological past. And so I actually had my own company for a number of years, which I'll get into later. But in that sort of same time period, I decided once I finished my BA degree to go straight into an MA research. And this was mostly due to the leadership of the Squamish Nation to direct me to document sites and places away from the shorelines. And this was partly because most of the research on the Northwest coast and the Pacific Northwest was along the shorelines of the oceans and up and down river valleys. And it was very seldom that anyone did any serious survey or research to look at contexts, landscape places that were away from those certain areas. So some of these chance finds that I mentioned were found by mountaineers and hikers way up in the Alpine. And the surveys that I did in my MA research, both on the coast and the interior, recorded dozens of archaeological sites in these remote, hard to access locations. And what was really interesting, along with that research, was the cultural knowledge. There was a strong amount of cultural information from the various communities that I worked with that I was only able to access through knowing about the cultural protocols of and practices of those communities to be able to understand these places. Because up until then, they really didn't fit into our standard archaeological interpretations. And so around the same time, I got fed up, to be honest, of working for other companies outside of my community. So I formed my own consulting company known as First Heritage Archaeological Consulting. And as a result, I began to train my relatives on how to do archaeological surveys and excavations and various other forms of work. And so the idea at this time was to build capacity. But with various young people, they have their own ideas and they move on to do other things. And I'm happy to say some of the people that you see in these photos went on. One of them is now co-chair of Squamish Nation Council. Another one is a successful lawyer. Another one is a successful cater business. So yeah, you try, but getting youth interested into their cultural heritage is very important, and they all carry that on in their various ways to this day. And around the same time, I did work elsewhere academically. Some of you may have heard of Gustafson Lake, late 1990s, pretty tense situation. The cultural name for this place is called Sepetan. And back in 2002, the Caribou Tribal Council, as a segment of the Secwepemc or Shuswap Nation, took an initiative with the University of Northern BC up in Prince George, and they wanted to do a collaborative field school. And so myself and another colleague, we ran this field school as a sort of 50-50 Indigenous, non-Indigenous student base. And what was really interesting here that, me being Squamish as an Indigenous person and my colleague being non-Indigenous, we felt that, well, we can't teach the local students about their history. So we invited elders to come in and actively be part of the curricula and fully acknowledge them in that role. And a bit later, this is still in the early 2000s, some of you may have heard about the Heuristic, or the Squamish Nation Land Use Plan, or heard about and remember the war in the woods, the Upper Ilaho, in the late 1990s. So what we see here on this map is on the left, the ancient temperate rainforests, all in green in 1900. And we look at the other map and fast forward 100 years later, all the yellow is been logged out or developed in some other fashion. And so there were very few remnants within our territory that were left for cultural use or intact archaeological sites. And so at this time, environmentalists, people from the Squamish Nation and elsewhere initiated the UTSAM, or the Witness Project, that you may have heard of. And so this was a 10-year-long endeavor that really cumulative effect developed into what the Squamish Nation was able to do in terms of land use planning, which is the Heuristic, or Sacred Lands report. And the map you see here that has different shaded areas, where areas that are designated for protection, restoration, and special management. And as a result, from this land use plan in 2001, the first draft, since then, the Squamish Nation controls over 90% of the forestry activities in our territory. And phase 2 and 3 are still underway, and I'll get more into that later. But what's really important here is those bright green areas that you see at the top of the Ilaho and Sims Creek and so on. These are legally and politically recognized areas that are protected. And culturally, in terms of heritage and archaeology here, what we were trying to achieve here is not protect just dots on maps. We're trying to protect the context of cultural heritage in a broader sense. And so phase 2, as you can see here, this is the confluence down below of the Cheakamus, Squamish, and a little further up the Squamish River, the Ashlew and Squamish River divides. The areas in sort of orange are more specific cultural areas that are now protected. And here's a map further south in Howe Sound that we are looking at other areas to try and protect due to cultural and environmental values, to sort of potentially constrain and not necessarily constrain development, but have a higher say about. So many of you probably remember, if you've lived in Squamish and Whistler, the announcement of the 2010 Winter Olympics, I believe in 2002. And so along with that, I was involved in the Place Name and Recognition Project along the Sea to Sky corridor. And here I'm interviewing my mom and other elders in the community, and also working with youth and people in technology to record and figure out how we can present our presence along the Sea to Sky corridor in preparation for this huge event. And so many of you probably know about the cultural journey from North Vancouver, starting at Horseshoe Bay, ending up in Mount Currie in Pemberton, in the Squamish Lowalt Cultural Center. And so this was years of research that really engaged the community in many different ways. And so this was a unique opportunity for myself to discover more of my cultural heritage and present it in a different way. because around this time in my career, I'd presented things in academic publications, and really, the stuff I talked about wasn't really understood by the community. So it was a way of translating my sort of academic ease language to be more publicly available. And so a lot of what you see in the kiosks up and on the Sea to Sky Highway, and also at the Squamish Loa Cultural Center, are my contributions to that. And again, it's not just me. There were many other people involved in this, but this is what we're talking about in terms of community archaeology and cultural heritage. It has to be a cumulative contribution. So back in 2006, I got tired of doing the business of archaeology. I got fed up with the government. I got fed up with industry. And I decided to go back to the ivory tower of academia. So I went to McMaster University to work under Aubrey Cannon, Dr. Aubrey Cannon, who is a high-profile Northwest Coast archaeologist, to do my PhD dissertation. And I wanted to tackle things on a landscape scale. And to do this, I looked at stone tools, or what we refer to in archaeology as lithics. And what I wanted to do is combine the cultural knowledge of where those stone tool materials came from, where they originated, the geological outcrops, and how they are distributed across Squamish territory and beyond. And what were the Indigenous perspectives of those materials? And so to do this, I had to get, of course, approval from the community for that cultural knowledge. But it was really trying to find those tangible links between cultural knowledge and the stone tools themselves. So in this map here, you can see the red dots that are stone tool locations, the sources of where those artifacts came, and the black dots where they had different associations. So the ones in red are associated with what I refer to as mythical beings. You may have heard of the Thunderbird, the Smilaith, or the Wild People, or the Bigfoot, or Sasquatch. Whereas the black ones are more related to what we refer to in Squamish history is the Hahais, or the Transformers. And the Transformers were characters in our history that were sent down to our territory to set the world right, because the world was in chaos. Things were wrong. People, animals, plants, and so on acted really strangely. So the Transformers, not the robots, were sent to make things proper. And so the result of that research, what demonstrated that there was differences in the uses of different stone tool materials. The ones in red were much more restricted, and I'll get more into that as I go along, whereas the ones in black were much more used in common day-to-day life. So my current projects focus on, again, building on the combination of the synergies between cultural and scientific knowledge. I use various scientific techniques to analyze artifacts, but then I also look at the oral history and traditions to find the links between those things. And this helps me inform future projects that I'll get into, what I'll be doing in the next 5 to 10 years as I move along here. And so what really enables me with this is the work of graduate students and undergraduate students here at SFU, and the information that I get from community, the Squamish Nation and other communities. And so I do a lot of this, what I refer to as lithic geochemistry, looking at the elements, the chemistry of artifacts and materials on a landscape scale. I present this in various ways through television and social media. You may have heard of Wild Archaeology, a TV show that I'm part of. There's 2 seasons now on Aboriginal People's Television Network, amongst other shows that I've been on. And, oops, I'm losing track here. And also in the past year, increasing my role as a cultural and heritage advisor for Squamish Nation Rights and Title. But also in the next year or so, I'll be presenting graphic novel works based on my research and my graduate students' research, and also my role as the director of the Bill Reid Center for Northwest Coast Research on Art here at SFU. And so, yeah, here's a crazy graph of lithic geochemistry. And you can see the different colors and different icons of various artifact samples. And the ones that are in green, red, and blue are materials from specific lithic sources or stone tool sources, such as obsidian, a volcanic glass, or dacite, or other volcanic rocks. And essentially what I'm showing here is everything that's within those oval ellipses can be tied statistically or scientifically back to a specific source. And this allows us as archaeologists to reconstruct ancient exchange and social networks. And I'll expand more on this as I go along. And so I mentioned wild archaeology, and it, for me as a researcher, has been an incredible way to present my research and my colleagues' research across the country between over 2 seasons, about 30 communities, to showcase that the archaeology being done in Canada now, as opposed to 30 years ago, which was really bad, that the archaeology being done now in modern day is being done with, by, and for Indigenous communities. And the pride that I take in this work is that it's a creative work, that it makes my academic research and other colleagues of mine, their research, more accessible and digestible to a broader audience. And so there are many shows on different channels, Discovery and History Channel, that are not very good. And so this is counter to what's out there. This is real archaeology. This is how it's done. This is how it's understood and interpreted. So if you watched it, great. Thank you very much. If you haven't, I encourage you to watch it and tell others. We do have plans for season 3. It's nationwide across Canada, but it's also available in the United States and limited in Europe. And so, yeah, currently there are 26 episodes, and the number of communities to view it are growing constantly. And so my work with the Squamish Nation recently with Rights and Title is mostly focused on developing cultural and heritage policy and permitting process. And really this is tied up in relation to what the provincial government requires in terms of archaeological assessments. And so what this really enables us to do is formalize our relationships, not only just with the province, but also with other Indigenous communities. And it also helps to review projects to keep track of what's going on in our territory and facilitate academic and other forms of research. So yeah, that's to be forthcoming. Another thing I'm really excited about are through a research grant is the creation of graphic novels, and to visually create ways to display our oral history and our archaeology in a graphic format, be it in print or online. And we have a lot of talent of artists. This is one of my cousins, Paul Nelson. We grew up together in Squamish. And this is some of the example of the artwork that I hope to employ to tell some of those oral histories and traditions in a graphic novel format. I mentioned the Hahais, the Transformers, and other histories, and there's so much to tell here. And so putting it in this format, and maybe even eventually in a cartoon or video format, will be quite exciting. I mentioned the Bill Reid Center. I'm the director of it, and it's required some sort of oversight. We're doing a lot of work with this because Dr. George MacDonald and other researchers worked with Bill Reid, a famous Haida Gwaii artist, that there is this huge physical and digital photo collection that we're trying to manage here at SFU. And in terms of Indigenous representation through media, we're developing a series of virtual presence and apps to use on mobile devices. And so we're working on trying to gain more support staff and work more closely with various Indigenous communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. So my future research, to finish up, I realize I've been going on a bit here. What I'm really hoping to do is, through the context of wild archaeology and other parts of my career, is to really focus in on what we're doing as what's called as community-based participatory research. For me, through field schools or specific projects with Indigenous communities in the Sea to Sky corridor, really focusing in on the cultural knowledge about the environment. Many of you have probably heard of the House on Biosphere Initiative and the sort of reemergence of life in Howe Sound and throughout the Sea to Sky corridor. And I want to integrate that with what we can look at in terms of stone tools that I mentioned earlier, and present this research through media and other creative works, and how this can aid Indigenous communities in their heritage policy and community collaboration. So community-based participatory research, you have to understand cultural protocols. And so, running research through field schools or any other projects needs to acknowledge those. And so what this really enables academic researchers to do is really open up the community interpretation of findings. We as archaeologists, we look at these artifacts and these sites, and we say it's this, but what do people in the community say about those? And so that's what I want to find out. And so one example is a site near Porto Cove. It's one of the oldest sites in Squamish territory. There's one of my cousins who helped find it and record it. Here's the map location of those things. Don't go and hike up there and dig around, please. They're protected under heritage legislation. But Porto Cove Provincial Park is an ideal location to host students and other researchers and community members to go and do this work. And so related to this is the cultural knowledge of this place and Howe Sound as a broader environment. And when we think about cultural knowledge, it includes all these different kinds of things that we can see in this list. And this is just a summary. And just as an example, this is a bit of a story. We have a term in Squamish language called means to go to the bathroom. And many of you may be familiar with Brome Ridge and Inchkai or Mount Garibaldi. This is a lava flow up on the slopes of Brome Ridge. And you can see water seeping down through the middle of the image. And this is a place name from the Squamish language, and it applies to this general location. And so I went up there with some geologists many years ago doing my PhD research, and yeah, we saw this water seeping out of the top of that lava flow. And I hiked up there excitedly as a PhD student and went, wow, what's going on here? And I looked, and there was a kind of a small well bubbling up out of the stone. And it was a bit of a hot spot where hot water comes up. And it bubbled up and it trickled down the one side of the rock formation and went down through the talus slope. And the literal translation of this place name means to pee underwater. And so I was always fascinated by this, and the elders, they always chuckled at me when I mentioned it. And so I went down the base of the talus slope, and I went down there, and it drained down into the creek, Brome Creek, and I took off my boots and socks and rolled up my pants, and I went into the creek, and it was nice warm water. And I don't know if any of you have friends or family when you were a little kid, or little ones that swam up to you in the pool, and they swam up to you and smiled and the water got warm. Anyhow, yeah, you can understand the translation here. But this is an example of cultural knowledge that you can only gain with going out onto the landscape, right? And so if you just took this for face value on a map or what have you in Google Earth, you wouldn't really understand it. So you need to go out there and discover these places for yourself. And once you discover them, leave them alone for what they're worth. But yeah, it was a place for people in our culture to start their bathing, so that wouldn't be too cold. It would be a nice start to their spiritual, physical, and emotional life. And so what I'm hoping to do in future years is look at the revitalization of house sound and address environmental and sustainable issues in this landform, and look at how people and resources, and not just in the modern day, but well into the ancient past, practice their life ways, and how this can inform us about what's going on in modern day and inform our decisions about land use and the environment. So language, cultural heritage values are very important to me as a researcher. And so Atal Kelson is very important. The marine and terrestrial environment. Many of you probably have heard of some of the initiatives that are already going on. But what I want to do as an archaeologist is to provide the long-term history in resource use and management. And we can do this through various archaeological scientific analysis, including stable isotopes, which tells us about the diets of marine and terrestrial animals, but also humans, ancient DNA, how that may have changed between various keystone species, such as salmon and herring, and really build on the relationships that are already there with other researchers from different academic institutions and communities. And yeah, this also builds on a lot of the work that's been done with the Squamish stream keepers and other community organizations. And so I'm really glad to reach out to you as different communities, different people, to let you know what I want to do. And so there's a lot of exciting stuff that we can share knowledge, uh, create a dynamic research environment to ensure common goals and visions for the future. And a lot of what I do is non-destructive, and there are various techniques that I won't go into here. We're running short on time, but there's a lot of links, not just what I'm doing here, what I'm proposing here. I have colleagues in Seychelles, uh, in Tsleil-Waututh and other areas throughout the Salish Sea that we can continue to build on these data sets and provide a way to connect communities in a broader scale. And so I mentioned obsidian, those volcanic rocks. Here's a crazy heat map. The darker the red is where more of that obsidian. I mentioned Inchkai, which is Mount Garibaldi, which is, I don't have a pointer here enabled, but you all know where that is. But the darker the red, the higher concentration of those materials. So here's the distribution of Inchkai or Mount Garibaldi material. And here's King Cum, which is up in another obsidian source. And so when we start overlaying these things, we start to see ways of how different communities interacted in the ancient past and how we can combine that with more recent and other forms of data, both archaeologically, culturally, and historically. And so a lot of what I do here is following what I've been doing with wild archaeology and other endeavors to present this knowledge through media and other creative works. And the reason why I do this is a lot of academic research is restricted to academic journals. It's hard to access. It's not very well understood, or it's misinterpreted by newspapers and news reporters and so on. So over recent years, through wild archaeology and other ways, creating storylines and ways for communities and researchers to tell their story properly is for me is really important. And again, a lot of this research and what you see on those television shows follows those Potlatch Protocols. And so, yeah, archaeology and heritage really needs to fall in line with what's going on legally and politically on a local, provincial, federal, and global scale. And yeah, we've all heard about hopefully heard of the United Declaration of Indigenous Rights and the federal and provincial recognition of that, and also the federal reconciliation report, but also, you know, recent events here in British Columbia and how this is playing out. And here at SFU, we have a report about Aboriginal Reconciliation Council. Nothing about us without us, that guides our research. And so it's not just about academic research anymore. We have to be aware about our ethical issues and standards. And so there are many things that we need to take into consideration here. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much. Jaco and Kuntomi, I thank you. And if we have any questions, I'm happy to answer, and I'll figure out a way to stop sharing my screen here. Maybe I'll just go like that. There we go.
Thank you, Rudy. I think if you go back down to the square at the bottom of in your menu, there's an option to stop sharing.
Okay.
Thank you for that talk. It was really wonderful. And as always, whenever we have speakers, I try not to dominate the question period because I have so many of my own. So I will say, if you are on Facebook or if you are in the Zoom call with us, please go ahead and type your questions into the chat box or into the Facebook comments, and we will take them as they come. But I will start with one of my own.
Sure.
And I think it's a softball. So what I was wondering is, this is from early in your talk when you were sort of speaking about your academic history. And I wanted to ask you about when the SFU department First Nations studies became Indigenous studies. Maybe our audience knows about that change, but could you speak to that for a minute?
Certainly. The history of it was initially a program started in the late 1990s by Dr. Marianne Ignace and Dr. George Nicholas at a SFU in Kamloops. And it then grew as a program to be started at SFU Burnaby campus in the late 1990s. And so it wasn't until 2012 where we had 4 part-time faculty. We were all cross-appointed with other departments, because as a program within a university, you cannot be a full department with cross-appointed faculty. And so we were then created as a department and then not give any extra positions. And it was thankfully by some good friends and colleagues that were in higher positions at the university that called out the administration to say we needed to have better recognition. And so since about 2017, 2018, we've had a number of exciting hires. We've grown as a department. It's a very dynamic place. We have everything from cultural heritage and archaeology. We have ethnobiology. We have Indigenous literature, art, and so many other things. So we're now a thriving department. It's very exciting.
That's very exciting to hear, although I'm sure the length of time it took to get there would have been a little frustrating, perhaps.
It was a bit of a struggle.
Yeah. Totally switching gears. I was wondering if you could speak to the experience of, well, I guess both wild archaeology and is the other show 1491?
Yes.
Could you speak to the experience of how you actually got involved with those shows? Does
Sure.
Somebody from the network reach out to you? What are the steps getting there?
It's actually the producers of those shows. They for Wild Arc, it was back in 2010 or thereabouts. Her name is Tracy German. She's a independent producer out of Toronto. She works at Sheridan College, and she reached out, a random phone call, and said, "I want to do a show on Indigenous archaeology," and she saw my name on a webpage. And so as it turned out, it was late 2010, and I was going to defend my dissertation at McMaster in 2011. And so I said, I'll be flying out, and let's meet at Pearson Airport. And I said, if you can give me a ride to the GO station that goes the train to Hamilton from Toronto, I'll be happy to meet. And so we had like a 2 or 3 hour meeting, and we just sat down and said, do we have a shared vision here? And we did. And it just went from there. And so we filmed a trailer the next season, the spring or summer, I forget which. It's almost 10 years ago. It's hard to believe. But that then got pitched to APTN, and they said, sure, we'll fund season 1. And they liked season 1. And then we got season 2, which is now available on APTN Lumi, which is their streaming device. And but since then, even prior to that, I was involved in a Discovery Channel episode, a one-off about Sasquatch, but I was seriously taken under context. I wasn't happy with that. So I learned about, about what am I getting into here. And I had done another one while doing wild archaeology. It's on Knowledge Network called Edziza, Life from Fire and Ice. It's about a huge volcano complex in northern BC and Tahltan territory, a hugely important place. But also, you may have heard of 1491, a book by Charles Mann, and producer Barbara Hairgar in Victoria invited me over for studio interviews to participate on that. So the sort of ball continues to roll with this media stuff, and for me, it's enjoyable. For me, it's as I mentioned in my talk, it's an academic responsibility to present archaeology and cultural heritage in a meaningful way. But for me, as an Indigenous person, it's also a culturally meaningful way to make sure our history, not just my community's history, but enabling other communities to have their history presented as the way they want. And so when I say archaeology done with, by, and for, this is the ultimate end result. It's like we as academics write about this on paper, but giving in the space on media, the presence. And when they see, and you think about this through multiple generations, down the road, when there's an elder recorded 2 years ago, 20 years from now, they pass on. And when the youth can see that this is the voice of your ancestor, to me, that's incredibly powerful.
You mentioned in your talk that some programs try this and miss the mark, or perhaps they're not featuring the right voices. Would you say that that's the biggest issue with these shows that kind of fail at that?
Oh yeah, yeah. It's a broad spectrum, right? You got everything from the really bad, like the Ancient Aliens, and all those things.
Bad but entertaining.
Very entertaining, but totally off the mark. No basis in archaeological science, no basis in cultural knowledge, right? So they're just wild accusations. We have a saying in science, profound interpretations require profound data, right? And so what we're trying to present in wild archaeology, in my research, and other, what we're trying to achieve in academic archaeology nowadays is we need that strong data to create these incredible interpretations, right? And so without that, we're just making up stuff. And so Indigenous knowledge isn't stories. It's not legends. It's real history. And the synergies between those different forms of Indigenous knowledge really mesh well. Like I talked about the weaving, like of the potlatch, the weaves and the wefts of the different kinds of knowledge. It's really incredible when you start to look at those different kinds of data, that it's there. When we talk about the ancient floods, but in Squamish, right? and that was a recent newspaper article. Yes, there were floods in the rivers, but at the end of the last ice age, we had the melting of huge continental scale glaciers that raised global and local sea levels as much as 1 to 200 meters above present day. And so you look at the modern town of Squamish, it would have been 200 meters underwater. So where would people have gone? Let's go up to the mountains. So, yeah.
I think that's such a powerful message that you mentioned. One of your slides mentioned TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. It's
Yes.
not just stories; it's data.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a light bulb there for me. Yeah, I think it's such a powerful message that well, I was telling Rudy before we started that I used to do freshwater fish research, and a lot of the streams that we studied around Bella Bella, the Celtic people knew about those salmon runs for, you know, literally time immemorial.
Yeah.
And it's not just a story about it. It's, oh, well, you know, this season when this ancestor fished it, you know, it was a bad season. And it's not, yeah, like you say, it's data. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Amazing. We have a question from the audience
Sure.
about and now this might not, this is sort of peripheral to what you spoke about tonight, but it's about the curriculum in BC schools. So whether this local knowledge is being incorporated into the curriculum these days.
Yeah, great question, and thank you for that. It depends on the school district, and really what it requires is the communication between teachers, administrators on the school district and the community. And there are some good models for that. You know, I think in the Squamish School District, you know, when I graduated from Howe Sound Secondary in 1990, and that there was nothing, right? And it really takes the will on both sides, right? It's not just a one street endeavor, and that's really what the story in academia archaeology has been. I was originally going to talk about that, and I had, you know, the talk I gave this evening was a bit different because the presentation that I wanted to give, I tried to download. This is a new laptop. It was corrupted from my cloud source, so I had to use this one as a backup, and it's very similar. So apologies for that. But in that original presentation that I was going to get at, the history of the discipline of archaeology is actually quite dark. And, you know, I don't want to sound too political here, but it's very colonial. It's about the investigation of other people's histories. And when we think about how that is done, you know, through the excavation, the analysis and interpretation of those materials, it's very different from what the actual home, the indigenous people would say, right? And so much of the early history of archaeology was about this, and it's very dark. You know, we talk about, you know, indigenous people say archaeologists were grave robbers, and they were. You know, I hate to say that. You know, it's a dark blight on the history of the discipline, but you know, when we think about how history is written as well, and um, how curricula is written, it's very similar. And so I think we're at the stage that we need to reconsider that. And so in archaeology, in anthropology, the 1960s, there were heavy critiques by Indigenous scholars about the discipline of archaeology and how things were interpreted. And it wasn't until 20, 30 years later that those scholars in archaeology started to go, we need to do something about this. And so I'm encouraged by that question, that how do we address this? What do we need to do? And the best advice I would give is just to reach out to the local communities and start to form those relationships. And again, I mentioned those Potlatch protocols. Those are kind of the things. It might be different for people up in Lowot. It might be different for people in other different territories, right? Every community has their own different protocols. So just to be aware that those protocols exist, that's the starting point.
I know here in Whistler we have Tanina Williams working. She's from the Lowot Nation,
Yep.
Working in our schools. I can't remember her exact title, but she's sort of the Indigenous liaison for the school.
Yep. That's great.
Which is amazing. And actually, shout out to Tanina. She just started a company that's actually offering that same service to businesses and organizations now. So that I think that's very cool.
Good for her.
Yeah. But it strikes me, Rudy, that over the course of your career, you've probably seen a lot of these changes happening. I mean, all too slowly. I mean, you mentioned, for example, UNDRIP, and what you very politely didn't mention was how slow Canada was to adopt that declaration, kind of embarrassingly so, given, well, Australia, the US, and Canada were the slowest countries
Yep.
to accept it. I mean, how has that...
And New Zealand.
Yeah, New Zealand, yes. Countries with huge Indigenous populations.
Yep.
How has that been reflected in your experience in academia? And as you were a contractor for a while, like a private contractor, how have those changes kind of manifested in your career, would you say? That might be a really intense question.
Yeah. Well, being the center of change, I guess, is like, when I started out, it was like I was angry, just like every other Indigenous person was. I don't like this. Why isn't it working? Why don't we do the things this way? And that's why I formed the company. And we start changing that. And both me and non-Indigenous colleagues really rallied to try and implement that change. And it wasn't just the way things can work. On one hand, you have legislation. On the other hand, you have the way people just do things, right? And the real change comes over here, because legislation will just spiral down and just maintain itself. But if you want to do real change, you want to change the way people just operate. You can still meet the needs of legislation, but it sets a bar here. But what you're trying to do over here with this group of people, you set the bar higher, right? So you just work outside of the legislation and you create your own process and understandings between the way a company works and the way a community works, and you come to those agreements. And it's just, yeah, as long as you meet those bare requirements, whatever, we don't care about what the province or whoever, right? We're doing things in a different way. And so that's where real change happens. And over time, more and more companies, more and more individuals do that, right? And it establishes a new norm, right? And so, but also within Indigenous communities, you create your own permitting and policies that are our highest standard. that are above and beyond what the province requires. And you work with those companies, those become your preferred companies or organizations that you are comfortable working in your territory. And so it's because certain certain policies and procedures within the government will not change. But there are other policies and procedures within provincial and federal government that you can take advantage of, right? That go beyond just simple archaeology. And so the land use plan that I talked about, creating those protected areas. It wasn't just about protecting small dots, archaeological dots of sites on maps. We're protecting big areas. And so that's where it makes a difference. And it's not to say that no one can go there, but it's just an increased awareness of what the values of those places are. And so, Whistler, for example, is a hugely popular place to go for mountain biking, for a whole wide range of things, right? And so we're not saying hands off of everything. It's just take into consideration different values. So
I have another audience question.
sure.
Somebody is very interested about the transformers.
Yeah.
I have to say, when you were showing that slide, it kind of occurred to me that a colonial government is happy to protect a site that has significance to a Western religion or a settler religion, but perhaps not a site that references a mythological creature from a First Nation story. Can you speak to that?
Oh, certainly. Yeah, that's a good question, and thank you, whoever asked that. What we're talking about here, on one hand, is what we refer to as tangible knowledge, things, and intangible. Intangible are things that are physical, right? Like your iPhone, a cup, something that's physical, an artifact, an archaeological site. Something that's intangible can relate to something that's physical, like one of these transformer sites. And I'll use the popular one that probably everyone knows is Psywash Rock, right? That's one of these transformer sites. We refer to it as Salish or Skalash. It means to stand up. And it is probably the most famous transformer or Hahai site. And it is, I have a current graduate student soon to be defending on all about this. But the thing is, a lot of these Hahais or transformer sites stand out from the local environment in different ways. And you think about when people first came to an area, they probably would have cued in like, damn, that's different, right? That stands out. That has some meaning, right? Think about when you fly to Paris and you see the Eiffel Tower. Bang, right? What identifies that place? The Eiffel Tower has no meaning. It's just a structure, right? Unless you know the purpose behind it, right? Or the Statue of Liberty, right? If you had no idea about the history, about what it was, it's just a woman holding up a torch and a book in a dress with a crown, right? And how do you interpret that? And so these transformer sites in Squamish territory, but also throughout the Pacific Northwest, had incredible cultural knowledge associated with them. And there's a whole narrative from place to place. There's a storyline, like a novel, that these individual, it depends on the community. There are groups of transformers. There's transformers and mink, transformers and coyote, like other characters, and they travel throughout certain community territories, and they make the world right for people, because earlier in our history things were in chaos, and so what their duty is to make the world livable. And so this is the narrative, that when you come across these places and when you see them, it's cultural teachings. When you see that, it's a lesson. That's a cultural lesson to remind not just kids but adults and elders about what the values of your territory are. And so there's another term in academia that we use called mnemonic devices, and they're things, they're symbols or designs or a place like a mountain range or a rock, that it triggers whole cultural knowledge and understanding of the world. And so these transformer sites are incredibly intangible. They are physical manifestations in one way, but in terms of archaeological legislation, they're not modified. Under the BC Heritage Conservation Act, they are, to be an archaeological site, it has to be something modified by people. So they need to be artifacts or features that were created by people in the past to be recognized as an archaeological site. So the struggle here is transformer sites are incredibly important, but are intangible. And so what my current graduate student is doing is to show that they're tangible. So to get them to be protected under some sort of fashion.
No small feat, I imagine.
Well, some are recorded, but not all.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a matter of creating a pathway to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm just going to remind our viewers, whether you're on Facebook or Zoom, we have a couple of minutes left. So if you do have any more questions for Dr. Reimer, please feel free to ask them. I have a couple more of my own, so I can keep going down my list. I wanted to ask.
I'm happy to stay on as long as we need.
That's very kind of you. Well, the next thing that I had on my list is you mentioned your involvement in the project to sort of establish the official place names along the Sea to Sky leading up to the games. I was wondering if, well, you could speak to that project a little bit more, but also have there been any continued efforts to officially get the names out for other places that maybe are not as prominent along the Sea to Sky?
Sure. Yeah, the place name and recognition was, many people probably have seen the signs and the kiosks along the Sea to Sky corridor. They're both Squamish and Lowot in origin, and the research behind those was done by various people in the communities, and it's great to see them, and still to this day watch people pull up and take time to absorb the information there. And my involvement in that was mostly sort of backgrounds, in terms of archaeology and cultural heritage, and then turn that over to a team that would make it more digestible to the public. Because me as an academic, I write in a certain way, and again, what I was getting at with wild archaeology, to make it more digestible to people, right? And but since then, we've engaged in, at least with Squamish Nation, in other ways, to work with the province and other organizations to get place names changed. And probably the biggest one is Mount Garibaldi. and it's the biggest landform, probably, along with, I'll say the Squamish name, Tuktukmuya Indian High or Black Tusk in the Sea to Sky corridor, right? And so big, huge, prominent peaks. And we are very close to changing the name of Mount Garibaldi to Inchkai. And so, yeah, it's, we think, I talk about this in my Indigenous Studies 212 class. I have a week-long lecture about place names and language. And we think about, how places are named. And when we look at sort of Western European tradition, things are named after people. Vancouver is named after George Vancouver. The Fraser River is named after, Fraser, right? And Garibaldi was named after some Italian patriot. Well, you can consider him a patriot by some. There's a matter of some debate there, right? And so, how does some guy in Italy from the 1800s relate to the history of the sea to sky corridor? It was some guy in Captain George Vancouver's crew that sailed up, and met Squamish people, and they saw this big mountain and went, that's Garibaldi. So apparently Garibaldi was a big thing back then. But, what is the place name that was there for over 10,000 years? It's along with the place name and recognition project along the Sea to Sky corridor, these are just some of our place names. Some of them we feel we can make public because of the nature of their history. There are other place names that we have that are more sensitive. So we're not ready to share those quite yet. So, but if people are more interested in place names throughout Squamish territory, Het who is co-chair of council in Squamish Nation, has his organization Quiot Staltmuth, and they have a place name map. So if anyone's more interested in that, there's some great information there.
I'm curious, once the name change is accepted, fingers crossed, will it have an impact on, like, for example, Garibaldi Provincial Park? Will there be a trickle down effect?
Yep, we're actually working with the park currently about signage. So the highest use area, I think, goes up to Elfin Lakes, and so yeah, we don't want to erase history. I think it's like this was formerly known as Mount Garibaldi, but it's really this. And then share that history. It's a legacy. So there are plans for interpretive history about that. That's in the works.
That's really exciting.
Yeah.
I guess for many people watching, the other example that comes to mind is Haida Gwaii being changed from the Queen Charlotte Islands, and like you say, it's not, nobody has forgotten that they were called the Queen Charlotte Islands. We're just recognizing, hey, actually they were called this for a long time before that.
And also the Salish Sea, which is a rebranding, but there's also people still refer to as the Strait of Georgia, and that's fine. And the Salish Sea is, those things have different meanings and could be used in different contexts.
Well, it is 8:30, and I know you said you would stay all night, but we are going to respect your time. And I think we've answered all the questions that rolled in. So I am going to say another big thank you to you, Dr. Reimer. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you to everybody who has been listening tonight. Folks, if you want to share this lecture with your friends and family, it's going to be on our Facebook page. Once we finish the live stream, you'll be able to find it there. Watch it again, and yeah, share it far and wide. Thank you so much to everybody. I am going to say, let's say a goodbye to Facebook first, and then we'll say goodbye to our friends on Zoom. So goodbye, Facebook land. Go ahead, Rudy.
And yeah, if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to reach out on email. I'm rudyr@sfu.ca. And in the spring, here at SFU, I've been nominated as a Canada Research Chair in Community Archaeology. So this is a really strong focus of my work. So anything that I can help answer or clarify, I'm more than happy to do that. And if anyone wants to read any of my more academic stuff, I can try and provide that as well. So no, I really appreciate this opportunity, and thank you, Jeanette, and everyone else who's to organize this. And I have tons of talks like this that I can do. So if you're looking for more down the road, let me know.
Awesome. Folks, you heard it here first. If you want to hear more from Dr. Reimer, let me know and I'll hook it up. All right, we're going to say goodbye to Facebook.